Welcome to the Environment Committee meeting for October 20th, 2021. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territories of the Sinead First People, Sinead First Nation. And the first item is to adopt the agenda. Somebody to move the adoption of the agenda, moved by Director Bonner, seconded by Jerome, and all in favor. The agenda adopted. And then the adoption of the minutes. Somebody to move the adoption of the minutes. Moved by Don, seconded by Jerome, all in favor. And brings us to 5. First off, introduction of a newly appointed member of the committee, or co-chair, Councillor Bonner. Don, in this forum. Don, would you like to say any words?
Well, hopefully people know of me or about me. I used to be the co-chair of the Health and Housing Task Force, and we didn't solve homelessness, so I'm joining the Environment Committee, so we can't solve the environment. So I'm shooting 0 for 0 here.
Very happy to have Dawn here, and yeah, welcome. So this brings us to our next item, the Reimagine Nanaimo Environment Policy Update, and Kirsty McDonald from our Parks and Open Space Planner will be presenting. Hello, Kirsty.
Thank you for having me. I'm part of the Reimagine Nanaimo team, and I know we've come to you a few times over the last year and a half, introducing you to different stages in the process, and Dave, Stuart, and Lisa Vokalsing are also here to frame up this conversation as well. We really want to give you an update on where we're at. We're at a really exciting stage in our project where we want to engage you more as a committee and really want to have more conversations as we talk about some crucial policy decisions. So I'm just going to share my screen and share with you a short PowerPoint. Everyone see that? Great. So this first slide is something that some of you might have seen before, but we think it sets the stage quite well for this conversation and discussions around sustainability and protecting our land resources for the next 30 years. And this is actually a creative community submission that we received in phase 1 of this process, and it was submitted by a local First Nations artist. But we just like to set the stage with this to remind ourselves why we're doing this, because our legacy of decisions today will help our children write us tomorrow for our children. So this has been a long process. We're just finishing up phase 2 and starting phase 3 of our process. And phase 3 is really where it all comes together, and we have actions and policies and really concrete information that we'll be sharing with yourselves and council. This process of Reimagine Nanaimo has had considerable community engagement, and just want to remind you of some of the themes that we've heard and what we're trying to reflect and bring back home in phase 3. There were a number of key priorities that were brought forward from the community. We had thousands of people respond to a survey that we held about a year ago, and climate change was really in the forefront of many of the submissions and the respondents. In general, we found that people really appreciate the access that Nanaimo has to nature and are concerned about the loss of natural areas. We heard a lot of feedback about community groups wanting us to market better our environmental successes and ways that we're already making incremental change to achieve environmental goals, and how we can encourage more behavioral change moving forward. We also heard a lot of people that want to volunteer in stewardship initiatives and want to have more direction from the city in that regard. But really, the environment and the natural beauty of where we live was in the forefront of people's minds. In phase 2, we've been going through about 3 months worth of land use workshops, really focused on how the community is going to grow. We've had about over 2,000 people participate in these discussions through a variety of engagement methods. We've had a number of public workshops, which I think some of you have been part of, as well as a focused stakeholder workshop with the Nanaimo Area Land Trust. And we've had 2 surveys that have been online, and the responses for those are just being compiled. We've also done a number of community outreach projects as well through social media and workshops. And this slide is not coming up, but I can tell you, there we go, that we're still working through our fulsome engagement summary for phase 2. We hope to have that released to council in the end of November. But some of the key themes that have been emerging through some of our discussions have included conserving our natural assets, really focusing on creating walkable communities and having transit that supports a walkable community as well, so we can have less car trips. That's been in the forefront of a lot of our discussions. Preserving wildlife corridors to connect open spaces, helping to integrate active transportation throughout the community, and realizing the importance of how that connects back to climate change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's been a lot of discussion about some specifics in different land use scenarios, and we're now working on bringing all that good information together and coming together with a final land use scenario that we will be sharing with council fairly soon. And it reflects all the information we've heard. Just a quick reminder that all of this work is being done with a framing concept of the donut, and recognizing that this will be our guiding, the concept of the Nanaimo donut will guide a lot of our decisions, and also it's framing 5 goals that are key to the development of Reimagine Nanaimo. So these are the 5 goals: a green Nanaimo, a healthy Nanaimo, a connected Nanaimo, an empowered Nanaimo, and an enabled Nanaimo. And we're just drafting the table of contents for this overall document, which we're calling Reimagine Nanaimo, or the City Plan. But each of these goals is linked to many topics that I think are of interest to this committee. So all of these topics on the right are related back to the Green Nanaimo goal, and definitely of environmental focus. But there's also many elements in these other goals that also, I think, are key to bringing forth environmental policies, including food security under a healthy Nanaimo, all the active transportation policies, which fall under a connected Nanaimo, parks and open space protection, which falls under an empowered Nanaimo, and also looking at placemaking in an enabled Nanaimo and how our scenic beauty and our location and landscape relate to making quality of life and the economy of our city move forward. Are there any questions before I move forward on what you've seen either on this slide or some of the previous slides? See nothing? I'll keep going. So this next slide outlines the structure of how we're creating the city plan. And anything in the blue in this top half is something that's adopted by bylaw and is not flexible. They're decisions that go through a lot of process, community process and council process to change. And they will be formulating the main policy components of our city plan. Anything that's under the lower half is flexible, and it's something that can be updated very easily. In this upper section, the donut and our goals, the foundations framework is the introduction of our document. Then the city structure, the land use components will also be a main part of the introduction. But the bulk of this city plan is going to be an integrated policy document. And it's bringing in a lot of documents and previous policy work, such as the climate change resilience strategy, that have never been part of the official community plan, and they're being elevated up to the official community plan. Climate action plan would be another example, urban forestry plan. So those policies from what used to be secondary documents are now being elevated into this overarching city plan. And we're hoping that that helps to bring some of those issues that perhaps in the past were not seen as integral to the growth and moving forward of the city, that they'll actually become part of that official community plan now. And under that sit a number of accessory plans, including council strategic plans, which with every council they get to set priorities. And hopefully some of those priorities might be items that are in our action plans, integrated action plans. And this is really a library of projects and programs that we are bringing forward as ideas to help achieve these city policies and also achieve some of the targets and indicators that are part of our monitoring plan. Sorry, things are slow, but this is going to come. The next few slides outline a number of already adopted policies by council that are part of our climate change resiliency strategy. And they're just examples to show you how we're elevating some of these policies into the new city plan. This is really slow. So first of all, under the goal of agreeing to NIMO, the policy of improving community capacity and resilience following events by increasing public awareness of climate change, its expected impacts, and how the community can prepare. Is policy that we are elevating, already adopted from this climate change resiliency strategy into the city plan policy. And related to that, a couple of action items that also are part of the strategy will be brought into our action plan. And examples are developing a sea level rise CPA with guidelines for new development, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Identifying forest interface and wildfire risks adjacent to residential areas, and that's also something we'll just talk about in a minute with a revised list of DPAs. Again, just an example of how we're integrating a strategy like this into the overall city plan. I'm just going to go back because there are a couple other examples that we have. No, it doesn't want to come up. Oh, there, no. I will just skip that for now. So right now, the city of Nanaimo has 9 development permit areas. Oh, here we go. Sorry, everyone. A little bit of a delay here. I'll go back to this slide then. This is another example of a climate change policy, which is currently sitting in our climate change and resiliency strategy that will be elevated to the city plan. So continuing to work with partners to minimize health impacts of extreme weather. And action plan items that we're bringing forward, developing an extreme heat response strategy that includes information on cooling spaces and can serve community members during heat waves. Also working with Island Health and other stakeholders to deliver coordinated information on what the public can do during heat waves. And some of this work is underway already, but it will be reflected again in those action plans. Also, under the goal of Green Nanaimo, striving to minimize urban and overland flooding resulting from heavy rainfall. And in the action plan, in order to achieve that, incorporating natural systems that help control stormwaters into capital projects. And this isn't a new idea, but it's something that we'll be promoting more through the action plan. It is currently being done in our Boxwood Connector project, which is near Northfield Road and Devon Park, where there's a stormwater management pond that the city built a couple years ago as part of roadworks. And also, you may or may not know, but City of Nanaimo has about over 10, probably closer to 15 stormwater management ponds currently sitting in city parks. Another policy example, improving the city's agility in responding and recovering from climate-related hazard events. And the action plan will also reflect this, incorporating climate change resilience into the review and development of asset management plans, and with other items like ensuring contingency reserves that contain an allowance for recovery from climate-related events. And lastly, I think this is the last example, working with neighborhood jurisdictions to support climate change resilience and limiting transfer of risk across jurisdictional boundaries. And an example of that would be continuing to work with the Sanemu First Nation and other regional partners on the Nanaimo Estuary Management Committee and the Nanaimo River Watershed Roundtable to support climate adaptation initiatives. And again, this is something that's already been ongoing for a number of years, but will continue. So these examples of policy are really just to frame future conversations. We hope to come back to you in about a month's time, around December 1st, and identify some more controversial policies. These are examples of ones that have already been approved by Council, but we're starting to go through a process where we're identifying policy gaps, bringing forward some potential new policies, and also bringing to light some policies that maybe have some conflict. There might be certain departments that have different mindsets about some of these policies, and we're trying to highlight where there potentially could be conflicts and try and balance those conflicts through some new language. So we're hoping to have another session with you where we bring forward some of those new policies and maybe some that show that conflict. Just going to go back to a slide here about development permit areas. And right now, the City of Nanaimo has 9 development permit areas, as well as a heritage conservation area. And right now, these sit in the official community plan. Through this process, we are also we're actually engaging a consultant. We have a grant to engage a consultant, and they are reviewing those development permit areas. They're looking at updated language, some of the feedback that we've already received through Phase 1 and Phase 2 related to them, and looking at best practices on how to update those policies, those development permit areas, sorry. And we're also looking at creating 3 new development permit areas, and those include sea level rise, which would come with a map to show areas of risk, coal mining hazards, again with a map and policies, and wildfire interface. And those are currently under construction, but we hope at a future date to bring those, both the map and some of the draft policies, to you as well for further review. It's also probably worth noting that it's now best practice to not have some of these development permit areas sit in the official community plan, and there are quite a few municipalities that are starting to adopt a secondary bylaw, development information area bylaw, that then the guidelines and the policies and the details of these DPAs actually sit in the zoning bylaw and have a little bit more enforcement ability and a little bit more teeth to them. And so that's something that we're looking at doing as well, having just general comments about them in the official community plan, but actually removing them into the zoning bylaw to follow best practices through the Local Government Act. And just to finish off, again, at this secondary discussion we're going to have in December with you, we're hoping to talk a little bit about behavioral change and how some of these targets and policies that we're creating really rely on the community making changes to the way that they live their daily lives in order to achieve what we're looking at achieving. And we want to reflect some of those actions and ways that the city can influence those actions in our action plans. And we'd like to have a further discussion with you about some of the ways we can influence that at a future workshop. So just to finish off, we're currently finishing off our Phase 2 engagement summary. We hope to have that soon. We're drafting policies and action plans as well as a final land use scenario. And we hope to meet with you again probably on December 1st to talk more about policies that are either new or have some conflicts around them, potentially, and also talk about behavioral change and some ways that we can influence the action plans. Then we hope to have materials go to council in December, and if everything is on track, potentially engage the public on these new policies, action plans, and really the draft city plan in the new year. And then we're hoping to bring back a revised version that reflects all that public feedback in the early spring. It's a very tight timeline, but that's the dates that we're targeting. Well, thank you for your time. I would like to know if there's any questions, anything that we can discuss further, highlight more, and if not, we'll see you hopefully in another month or so to have a bit more discussion on policies.
Thank you, Kirsty. Any?
Jerome has raised his hand.
Oh yeah. Questions? Jerome.
A couple questions. I'll just start with the first one. I'm curious how the city deals with these new DPAs or existing DPAs, and how do you grandfather existing infrastructure into these new sets of rules, basically? So there's the sea level rise and flood example, but then if you're proposing also one related to coal mining hazards, how does that play out?
I think Jeremy's going to take this one.
Sure, yeah, sorry. I'll jump in, hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
And so yeah, as far as grandfathering, there's, when it comes down to changes in zoning, there's provisions for protection from change in bylaw in the Local Government Act. That's generally referred to as grandfathering, but it's sort of lawful non-conforming allowances in the Local Government Act. That's for change in zoning bylaw that has implications to existing, you're talking about existing structures, existing houses, and that type of thing, I believe. When it comes to the development permit area guidelines, they're basically, by the nature of the development permit, it's intended to permit development, but under certain conditions. So the conditions that are in place to permit development have changed if we adopt new development permit area guidelines, or even adjust the current guidelines that we have. So the conditions to permit development have changed, but it's not necessarily prohibiting development. It may limit development in certain ways so that it has to take place in a manner that's consistent with the development permit area requirements, but it wouldn't necessarily prohibit development like a change in zoning could. And there's actually more, it's kind of a good segue, good question, and there's probably some more detail that we can get into in the next presentation specific to watercourse protection, and because we have experience in that case and we can walk the committee through it. We've experienced changes in regulations, and we can talk about some of the implications there. Sure. I hope that answered the question, but I'm happy to expand on that if not.
No, I think it does. What I wonder about is if you basically create these DPAs and people have houses in areas that are now identified as floodable under various scenarios, especially if you link them to streams or near streams or something like that. It just changes basically the conditions under which if they want to do anything on their property or sell their property, there's a new set of rules that now apply. Is that right? Yeah.
That is true. Yeah. Thank you. Through the chair, that is true. And in some cases, like for instance, sea level rise, there's an awareness, and there are already. If somebody say were to come in, there should be an awareness of the potential for sea level rise implications in different parts of the city. The city has adopted, and the Environment Committee was involved in, Council has adopted a climate change resilience strategy that identifies specifically sea level rise and through mapping identifies some of the implications and identifies hazards related to, because it's not only a flood hazard, there's obviously potential for increased coastal erosion and that type of thing through just rising sea levels and increasing storm energy. So that there is some information out there, so it shouldn't be unexpected in some ways. So we also have certain areas that are already, subject to requirements. For instance, for instance, there's an area in the north slope that is identified as a coastal erosion hazard and a slope stability hazard area. It's in our current development permit guidelines, so that won't be necessarily new. It may be expanded, there may be increased requirements, you're right, and increased information probably to support development, but the hazard should be known. And like I say, Council has endorsed, and it's publicly available, the climate change resilience strategy. As well, there are requirements under the Community Charter and the Land Title Act through Community Charter through building permit currently, and the Land Title Act in the case of subdivision that generally we're already seeing as sort of a standard approval requirement for development. Say a geotechnical report to address the impacts of sea level rise in coastal areas. So if you come in for building permit or subdivision in a coastal area, that's something, a low-lying area, that's something you can generally anticipate now. It does sort of expand the requirements more broadly, I guess, and raises awareness of the issue more broadly. So it does have implications to to property owners and subsequent purchasers and developers. There's no doubt about that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Don?
Thank you, Chair. I'm kind of questioning about the timeline here. Like, as it's mentioned, I just looked at Council's calendar, and we have a GPC on the I think we have a council meeting on the 6th, a GPC meeting on the 13th, and a council meeting on the 20th. And I think we're scheduled to have a meeting on the 1st. But we're probably not going to see a lot of this stuff until the agenda comes out, which we won't have a lot of time to talk about the policies that are anticipated to coming down. So I'm wondering how much influence are we going to have on these policies and bylaws that will be coming for council if we're all doing everything in the same month, sort of thing.
Okay, through the chair to Councillor Don. That's a really good question. We know that there are several policies that council has already endorsed. So what we're trying to do is come back to both this committee and then also you're aware that we have a council workshop on September 8th with key things that are a departure from where we're going. So today, for example, getting your confirmation that we are proceeding in the right direction with the new development permit areas is one piece for some feedback. I know we don't have them drafted for you. And although we're going to be coming to the Environment Committee, it's December 1st, and what we'll be doing is taking some of the key things that are new and haven't been introduced yet, and to get that feedback. We may not have all of them done, and what we may end up doing is in January having another session with you after we've sat down with council on a few key policies. So we are in a bit of a crunch. We are literally taking hundreds of lines in a database across several documents and pulling them into one. So it's a sort of stay tuned, we're doing our best, and you will get input on the key ones that are departures from what we're currently doing that we need your feedback on, rather than focusing on ones that you've already endorsed through existing documents. Like Christy's actually shown some of the ones that this committee's gone through in some detail with the climate change mitigation. And our hope is that by January, you start seeing a fleshed out document. So you start seeing where everything fits and the draft document. And then it's much easier to critique that and see, are there any gaps we've missed? The other piece to December 1st is we're hoping to have one of the landmark consultants back with us to talk about what they're seeing as gaps and suggested ways to fill that in the current policies that we're putting together. So I'm not sure I've given you a great answer, but hopefully that is gives you a bit more assurance that we're doing our best to get you materials before we go out to the public in January, February next year.
Great. Any more questions?
Lindsay has her hand up.
Oh, Lindsay?
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry my video's off, my kids are everywhere. And we're in a open plan house now, so it's a bit tricky. I just want to say, Kirsty, I got your call on my office phone, but I'm on sabbatical, so I rarely get phone calls there, but I got your email too, and I hope you got my email reply. I can help in terms of, guiding with respect to behavior change, given my, I don't really do research in it. I do a little bit, but I know the literature very well. And I can guide that. It's very complex to do that. Behavior change is really, really hard. So I hope I can be involved in those discussions and the planning of that, if there is going to be a workshop revolving around that on the 1st, so that will be good. The other thing I wanted to note was, would you mind going back to the slide? It's at the very beginning about priorities, the ones related to environment and climate change. I guess there's survey results.
Oh, sure.
From phase 1, does that look right? Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to say, that's cool. I wanted to know if this data was coming from qualitative, like open-ended responses, and if there was a way to say a ranking or, to weight these, to know which ones were the most important to people. Most of this was from open-ended questions, Lindsay, but I can get you that, closed-ended questions. Most of them were like a scale, but I can dig up those details. It's been, Lisa, you might remember, but it's been 6+ months since we've looked at this data. But I'm pretty sure that at least the statistically significant sample were all on a scale of 1 to 10. And that's something that I think, Lindsay, you and I were in the same workshop breakout room after this had already been released, and we were discussing what the implications of that might be for some of those results, and really appreciated your expertise on that. But it had already launched, and I know the statistically significant ones were a replication of a lot of the data that we've been collecting for about 20 years. And so we were trying to have baseline data for it, and they had all used those 1 to 10 scales. But some of these responses were comments, and we can definitely look at some of the demographic comparisons and see some of those open-ended comments. Were they, what age range were they from, what neighborhood were they from? So we can pull some additional information, but I don't think that we can dive into it quite as much as you next time, but I don't think we can for this review. No worries. Okay, thank you. And we would love to work with you and flesh out discussions for potentially December 1st, Lindsay. So I'll be in touch with you about that, probably via email. Perfect. Love it.
Great. I've seen Jerome. Do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I do. But I think Lisa had her hand up first, so.
Okay, Lisa.
Thank you. I was wanting to respond to Lindsay and let you know that the phase 1 engagement results remain very important, along with phase 2 that are being placed right now, because what it does is when we go back and we have to come back to you and say, okay, here are some new policies we're proposing, ones that maybe are redundant. We have to ground this in what the community's told us, both in the statistically valid surveys and also the other input we've gotten through workshops and more open-ended, unstructured feedback. So this becomes a very important source of information that tells us what the community's priorities are. And our consultants are using this as we start collating our policies and framing up the document. And that's important for council because as the community, in terms of us being accountable back to them, they told us what they wanted. How do we actually show them that we're going to achieve that? The other thing I wanted to say, Lindsay, that one of the things we'd appreciate your help with is, while we appreciate the mechanics of behavioral change is quite complex, this is one of the areas where we might need some strategic policy wording around, is there some wording we need in the document that acknowledges that behavior change is a huge part of us meeting certain targets and indicators, and how do we frame that up in a level that then allows us to take actions in the action plan. I think that's where we would appreciate a bit of feedback from you as we look at that one element that might be missing in terms of our area of influence. So, thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Jerome.
Yeah, my question has to do with the issue that we've been sort of bumping around or pushing back for a lot of meetings. It has to do with the targets and the indicators related to greenhouse gas emissions. This has been a topic that we have tried to sort of get into a number of times, and for all kinds of reasons, it's always sort of been delayed. And I guess part of me is wondering, but also worrying, that this issue is being shunted in a way where we'll never be able to address it properly. And why it bothers me so much is because it is an issue that applies or pervades, it's pervasive through 5 of these goals, arguably, to varying degrees. And so having it relegated to the green goal only, we basically had no opportunity to even examine what those targets might be, the future targets. Currently the plan is being formed based on the previous I guess OCP or whatever it was, version of a plan that had targets, but those are arguably outdated and we might want to revise them fairly strongly. But because that single issue is so important to all the other 5 goals, I'm wondering where there will be time and space, and given the very constricted timeline that we're seeing, I mean, are we ever going to be able to have serious discussions about that particular topic?
I think I'll, with permission, try and respond to that, to the chair.
Go ahead, Lisa.
So, Jerome, this is, now, I think you participated in some of the, or at least one of the land use scenarios workshop, where there was a very high-level analysis between the 3 different scenarios, including the status quo, how well each one of them did specific to greenhouse gas emissions. So, in terms of the, I think what you're saying is that setting the target is important to then determining what the policies are to reach that target and the action. Am I hearing that correctly? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what I'm saying is that I think if you're referring to I think it's the last meeting or the second to last meeting we had with the Leonard consultants where that issue was brought up briefly. It's all done under the old target.
I mean, maybe I can jump in there just for a second. My understanding, Jerome, is basically like when council set the climate emergency declaration, we changed our greenhouse gas emissions targets to be aligned with what the IPCC was calling for. And that direction was given to our consultant, Duncan, who did modeling and is putting together, a series of policies for us to review. Based on that new target. Now, he has come back to said to us that our ability to attain that target, given the policy options that are currently available, without more serious provincial intervention, is going to be very difficult and very, very difficult. But what direction we gave him was that we want to take the most aggressive position possible with what we can do. In terms of the policy options. And so my understanding is that that's the direction that he was given, that he'll be coming back to this committee December 1st with that analysis and those policy options, to fill in the gaps of what our current collection of policies are. So that's my current understanding, and I don't know if that is different from what you understood, Jerome, and if both of us, Jerome and I, are not seeing the picture quite clearly of what is actually happening.
Could I add to that, through the chair?
Yeah.
So in addition to that, the other piece is that the 3 different land use scenarios are attempting to evaluate how to move more aggressively towards the different goals, including GHGs. And so one of the discussions on December 1st will be, right now we think we're looking at a hybrid between scenario 2 and 3 in terms of the land use, and looking at where that takes us without GHGs and the trade-offs with some of the other goals. Now, while we're focusing on the policy pieces, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, Councillor Getterbark, about, and this is why Christy mentioned the behavioural change, is that some of the ways in which we need to advance on the GHGs require things that we influence, but don't necessarily control. So we can control things like how we build roads, where we direct development to some extent, stormwater management and things like that. But getting people to shift more aggressively from different fuels and other things that lay at a higher level is where you're right, we need to look at what we can do, and we're hoping that, or we're anticipating that Lanark are coming back with that piece. So Jerome, I realize this is not an exact science or process, because we're balancing both what we control and what we influence. That's what we're hoping on the 1st to come back with you, back to you. Yeah, so I think it's a wait and see, and we are aggressively trying quite hard to kind of meet these timelines and deadlines. And if by the 1st we have some but not all of the draft policy wording for you, what we hope is that we get your feedback on what additional things we need to look at doing that are within our ability to control in these types of documents.
I mean, I understand I understand the reality of, what you can, like you said, like what you can control, what you can influence, but, well, I guess we'll wait till December and see what is presented to us. The risk I see is that this train it seems like it's moving down the track so fast that between 2 meetings, so much happens. And your timeline, if those policy documents don't show up in terms of greenhouse gas scenarios, the train keeps moving. And then the further it moves, the less chance we have of course correcting or modifying anything. Because I appreciate that we have adopted, with the climate emergency, a series of targets, but I think that everybody would agree that those targets are outdated now already. I mean, the next round of COP meeting is next year. That means that there's a whole other IPCC set of documents coming out, and those numbers are not going down, guaranteed. So, in a way, just by the fact that we're using those numbers and when they were produced, they're outdated. So I understand that there are limits to what we can do. When it comes to framing a question or framing a policy, I don't really see a problem with framing it, let's call it aspirationally, or at least aiming very high, even though we realize that there are limits to what we can achieve. It does actually set a tone, and it also really sort of positions the city in terms of what it takes more seriously and how it's trying to achieve particular goals. So I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. And what I'd really like to see is a time where we can actually look at these policy options and what they look like, and the discussion that would ensue around those questions. But we'll wait till December if that's hopefully happening.
Thank you, Jerome. And so just to confirm with staff, the expectation that December 1st will be a bit more of a policy workshop type meeting, is that realistic and reasonable sort of understanding on our on this committee's end?
Yes, through the chair, I realize Councilwoman and Jeremy are speaking as well, but yes, that is the expectation, is that we have several concrete, we have wording for you to respond to and provide feedback on. And part of the work also too with the land use scenarios is showing our high-level analysis of how far we think these policies and how fast they're going to get us towards targets, even if the targets move, identifying, okay, you know, which of our different policies and strategies do we bump up because it has a more aggressive advancement towards our targets. And one of the challenges for council will be balancing our high-level analysis of the all the other different goals, some of which are in sync with GHG emission and reduction, and others which might have competing kind of interests in terms of their outcomes.
Right. That'll require a political prioritization, a discussion that you know, council will have to battle out. Dawn?
Oh, I think I'll let Jeremy go first. Staff always know what they're doing.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand there, Jeremy. The screen's not super clear there, and my failing eyesight these days, I can't quite make it out unless I look to my left, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm just going to, I'll try not to prove Councillor Bonner wrong, but in his statement about staff's knowledge. But I actually just wanted to jump on and respond to something that Jerome said that I think is definitely worth highlighting. And Kirsty, if you don't mind just going back to the previous slide that showed the 5 goals, thanks. You mentioned, Jerome, I think that there's no doubt that the climate mitigation piece lands under all of these, to some extent, in different ways under all of these goals. So that's definitely something that you know, that we're mindful of, and you'll see. I know in the sort of on the right-hand side there, just, you know, really high level kind of simplistically sort of identifies GHGs under the Green and IMO resilient regenerative ecosystems piece, but like you've flagged, I just wanted to follow up to acknowledge that you know, obviously that you know, that definitely, it'll permeate the plan, so in all of the 5 goals. So I just wanted to flag that and acknowledge it. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Don?
Thanks, Chair. This is a new kid on the block question, which kind of Jerome tweaked me to it. Are we in this committee looking at the items under Green and IMO, or are we looking at bylaws and everything under all 5? I quite think that environment and climate change affects all 5. So I'm just kind of curious, how is that working?
To the chair, I can respond to that. Lisa, you can jump in. It's been a really interesting exercise to start sorting many of these topics and goals, because we find that there's a lot of the goals that, or the topics that permeate all these goals. And we've had to categorize them, and that's the only reason you see the Green and IMO reflecting the GHGs, but there's many items that permeate all of these goals. And the way the document will be set up, there'll be many hyperlinks so that we can see those cross connections and the related policies and the related areas. But we had to categorize things, and so there are many items, there are many environmental type policies that are in definitely the Green and IMO. I would say a healthy community, connected Nanaimo, empowered Nanaimo, and then probably an enabled as well. So it's not just the GHGs. I think a lot of the items are transcendent around all these goals. Lisa might have more to add there. I also just wanted to note too that the monitoring plans that Jerome was speaking to previously fall in our unadopted by bylaw element. So they're very, the targets and the monitoring, the indicators can be updated very easily, and there's something that we would expect within the next 10 years before we redo the city plan to update on a regular basis, as opposed to the policy part, which are on the top, which are adopted by bylaw and can be updated, but they take more of a process. But these, council could look at the monitoring plan annually and update targets and indicators on a more frequent basis if they choose as well, in the pursuit of achieving these goals, which really do transcend many topics and many areas.
Thank you for that. It was, my hope was that we would have an opportunity to look at all bylaws coming before council before they come to the, that to me was in terms of reference that the committee was set up in, is that nothing, like, I would hope that nothing hits council that this committee hasn't even looked at and said, well, it's got nothing to do with the environment, or it does and here's our opinions on it. So that's kind of what I was hoping that this is what's going to come out of it. And I think it will. It's just a roundabout way of going at it, sort of thing. So I'm happy so far.
Yeah, I think just a couple points on that, like in terms of environmental policy that permeates, the other 4 goals. It's like in the donut framework, where the green and resilient regenerative ecosystems is sort of that circle that encompasses sort of the social foundation in the middle. It the green part is sort of the foundation that everything is built on, and so that there's green that permeates through those other 4 goals, and being able to represent that in a way visually or in some way can be helpful, because it is interesting. We did discuss earlier, which led to the donut, but we had a previous environmental framework that had, climate action and had energy and zero waste, and then it had a healthy community, which things like active transportation, food security all sat in, and it kind of made everything, that was things in the social foundation. It kind of compressed it all into, the purview of environmental sustainability. Depending on the different categories and models you use, it changes how it's represented, but I think that's something that is important that we don't lose sight of, because the environment is, a policy aspect in all of those other 4 goals and critically linked. And the other thing, just speaking to Dawn's comment about, this committee reviewing policies that are bylaws coming forward to council, I think because we've been doing the official community plan update, and there's been some higher level structural issues and considerations we needed to go through in terms of how we're managing environment with the city of Nanaimo, and how we're going forward with this plan update. The conversation's been pulled out a bit higher level than specifics, and hopefully, as we get a bit of a roadmap again, we can get into the details of the different policies that will be coming forward, and that's something that, a larger role that this committee can play as we go forward. Is there any other comments or questions for Kirsty on this?
Jeremy has his hand raised.
Oh, Jeremy, go ahead. Jeremy, do you have your hand raised?
I didn't intend to. Do I have it raised?
Oh yeah, it is raised.
Oh wait, sorry, it didn't automatically lower. My apologies.
Your little bubble's not always on the screen, so we don't see it. Okay.
Okay, no, thank you.
Well, I guess we'll move on to the next item, and Kevin Bridges, our Environmental Protection Officer, is giving a presentation, and this review sort of was spurred out of a council motion to look at our watercourse protection regulations and see how it's working for us, and what improvements we could potentially make to it. So, hand it over to you, Kevin.
Hi there, and thank you for inviting me. I just gotta put this thing in so I can share the screen. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so as Chair said, my name is Kevin Bruce, I'm the Environmental Protection Officer with the City of Nanaimo, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is watercourse protection and a framework for review. I think the initial steps we'd like to take in this presentation is to go through some of the information and just provide information on what legislation and what processes and policies we already undertake for watercourse protection. So the first step is we're going to look at the higher level legislations, which are the federal and provincial legislation code. With regards to federal, we have the Fisheries Act. How does the Fisheries Act affect what the City of Nanaimo does? And for the most part, it affects us from a perspective of something called harm for alteration, disruption and destruction of fish habitat, or had, and we cannot create one of those. So those are things we look at when we look at development as well as capital works projects, as to whether those types of things will be happening. The other piece of the Fisheries Act that applies to the city is that it is part of the cycle of the Riparian Areas Protection Act and the provincial legislation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The other federal legislation we look at a fair amount is the Species at Risk Act, and what we look at there is the Species at Risk Act and COSULIC have identified specific plants and animals that are endangered, and there are recovery strategies out there that the federal government has applied. For example, the Western painted turtle. And when we see recovery strategies like that, they've identified areas of potential critical habitat. So when we do a review of a development or development application, we have to look at those areas and say, hey, is there any critical habitat for the Western painted turtle in these areas? And if there are, we have to be very specific about is it there, and if it is, how do we protect it? Moving to the provincial legislation, we have, of course, the Local Government Act, which is the act that gives us a lot of the powers we use to protect our watercourses. We have the Wildlife Act, which obviously protects wildlife and the different species of birds. We have the Riparian Area Protection Act, which is specific to, which is the old Fisheries Protection Act, so it works to protect watercourses, creeks, rivers, and streams that have fish in them, and then through that is the Riparian Area Protection Regulation, which gives us the guidance on how to apply that act. Connected to those two, as I mentioned before, is the Fisheries Act, because the whole premise of the Riparian Area Protection Act and the Riparian Area Protection Regulation is that you don't create a had as described before under the Fisheries Act, and if you follow the prescriptions of the regulation, then that should not happen. The next piece of legislation is the Water Sustainability Act. That comes into play for the city when we're doing stream crossing, bridges, or pipelines, or driveways, any of that sort of stuff. Any works in and about a stream requires what we call Section 11 under the Act. And the Act is also, when it came the Water Sustainability Act, and I'm probably not going to get the date right, 2016, I think it was, or 15, they also the province put in more protection for aquatic ecosystems. So lakes and wetlands got better protection through the province. And contaminated sites regulation looks at soil contamination and how to process that stuff. So, through the Local Government Act, gives us powers to protect the natural environment. We do that through several bylaws. One is through the Official Community Plan, which is developed permit areas, 1 and 2 specifically in this case. Through our zoning bylaw 4500, which sets up our setback areas, and the Management Protection of Trees bylaw, which identifies that any trees that are within a DPA, so DPA 1 or 2, is a protected tree and can't be removed without permit. We also have pesticide use bylaw and the soil removal and housing bylaw, which don't play a huge role in watercourse protection, but they are there for environmental protection. This is a map of our DPA areas, the Fish Community Plan. It identifies many of the watercourses and their setbacks that are required through the DPA. Details about the zoning bylaw and 4500. The protection measures within the zoning bylaw are that there's a 15 or 30 meter setback from top bank of the stream, and that is dependent on the size of the stream and its current riparian state. We also have 15 meter setback from wetland boundary of a lake or wetland. Also with 3 meters or 7.5 meters on non-fish bearing watercourses from top of bank as well. This bylaw can be varied through the permit process, and one of the other important things to understand in the zoning bylaw is that lot areas, when creating new lots, lot areas are exclusive, or minimum lot areas are exclusive from the aquatic setback area, which means that the aquatic area, setback area will be protected in residential zones. This is Schedule C of the zoning bylaw, and it identifies all our watercourses and their corresponding setbacks. This document is used mostly as a flag when we receive development applications or proposals. When we see that one of these watercourses is within that development area, we generally would then trigger us to say, as staff say, we need more detailed assessments or surveys with regards to this area, because Cobble Creek is in the middle of it, or as it goes along. And those more detailed assessments would look at things like what we have here, which is our definition of top of bank and wetland boundary through the bylaw. And it can be fairly complicated when we get into more steep terrain. It's not just as simple as finding the edge of the water and measuring. It looks at topography, it looks at valley bottoms, and it looks at wetland vegetation as guides to where we start drawing our lines from top of bank, and then it would define our setback from there. I can go into more detail later in this if you like. The next part of this is how do we get the current framework developed. So watercourse protection regulations were adopted in zoning bylaw 4000 in 1996. In 2004, the Fish Protection Act, or now the Riparian Area Protection Act, was brought in by the province, with the corresponding riparian area regulation, which was changed to Riparian Area Protection Regulation 2019. In order to comply with that provincial regulations, the municipalities had two options for compliance. The first one was to institute what we call riparian assessment areas, which is just a blanket 30-meter assessment area around any known watercourses, and any development that was proposed within that RAA would trigger what we call a detailed assessment under the Riparian Area Protection Regulation, and that detailed assessment would then define what the setback or SPIA would be, or setback for in our bylaw case. Or the other option was what we call a meet it or beat it requirement or option, which is either you meet or exceed the wrapper requirement. Because the city at the time had its own watercourse bylaws and DPAs for watercourse setbacks, we chose to do the meet or exceed method for complying with wrapper. And through that process, we did a wrapper simple assessment methodology, which looked at all our streams and applied a process which looked at existing riparian corridors, developed out areas, and through that process, you get an idea of what the appropriate setback should be with regard through the wrapper. And in all cases except 3, our bylaw beat the riparian area protection regulation requirement, and those 3 that did not meet it were increased to 30 meters, so they would comply. Again, back to the zoning bylaw, we've had it in place since 1996. As I just mentioned, the city of Nanaimo's watercourse setbacks meet or exceed the wrapper requirements. Riparian area protection regulation is triggered when a variance to our watercourse setbacks is requested. So if someone for some reason wants to develop within that 15 or 30 meter setback from a watercourse, as soon as that request is made, or it triggers a detailed assessment under the riparian area protection regulation. One of the issues with the wrapper is that it does not consider wildlife habitat, and the local government does have the discretion to have more stringent protection requirements than wrapper. And protection requirements looking at things like wildlife corridors, trying to create contiguous corridors between habitats, and improving form and function of that riparian. Within our development permit areas was DPA 1, which is just to differentiate between DPA 1 and development permit area 2. DPA 1 is specific to fish-bearing watercourses, where DPA 2 is for environmentally sensitive areas, which includes non-fish-bearing creeks and streams. So development permits identify and protect aquatic and environmentally sensitive area setbacks. A lot affected by a development permit area is required to go through a DP process. And then when we go through the development permit process, if it's used to vary the bylaw to allow for the development, there are a few things that we do as staff to work through that application prior to it getting supported by staff before it goes to council for approval. One of the main ones for residential lots is this an existing legal lot, and was the lot created prior to 1996, which is when the bylaw came in. And that all mechanisms to avoid the development permit area and the setback are exhausted. And when I say mechanisms to avoid, we look at things like varying other front yard setback or back rear yard setback, those types of things first before we look at varying the aquatic or watercourse setbacks. If there is an encroachment, that encroachment is mitigated to a known net loss or function of habitat, and DP conditions ensure that mitigation is successful. And through DP conditions, we usually take security to ensure that the mitigation, which is usually either a replanting plan or a restoration plan for existing area or setback, so that if, for whatever reason, if it doesn't happen, there's bonding there so we can move forward to make it happen. Really touch base on the riparian area protection regulation. It's a provincial regulation for the protection of riparian habitat. It is protection for fish and fish habitat only, and that is a really key differentiation to make between that and our bylaw. Stream protection and enhancement area, which is the SPIA, an acronym, is measured from the high water mark of a stream, and the SPIA is the minimum protection to avoid harmful alteration, disruption, and destruction under the Fisheries Act, hence the correlation back to the federal legislation. Some frequently asked questions are city setbacks and our stream site protection and enhancement areas the same? And the answer to that question is no. And the reason why is really be explained in this diagram. So this is a single-family lot with an existing dwelling on it. So a few of the differences between the wrapper and our aquatic setbacks is, first of all, the streamside protection enhancement area is measured from the high water mark of the stream, where our watercourse bylaw is measured from the top of the bank. This can make a significant difference, especially if you've got large valley bottoms, etc., where you have steep slopes on the sides. What it does is it pushes the top of the bank up, so you get more riparian protection for wildlife habitat, also for flood protection, etc. So, also the wrapper is only to protect fish and fish habitat. And our setbacks are there to help protect more form and function of riparian, the watercourse itself, wildlife habitat, and the corridors that exist within them. And it also helps, having those larger areas helps mitigate some flooding areas. So in this photograph we've got a bunch of lines drawn. The blue line is creek. The red line is the 10-meter streamside protection enhancement area through the RAR, and the green line is the City of Nanaimo 50-meter watercourse setback. There's a difference there, twofold, as our setback is larger, but also top of bank is, in this case, is not the same location as high water mark. The other line you see on here is the purple line, I'll call it, and it's the setback line from the ocean, so the natural boundary of the ocean, so that falls under the non-permit area too. A couple other questions. When is council approval required? Council approval will be required when an application is made to vary that setback, and we work through our internal processes here to ensure that it's pretty much the only way in order to allow development on an existing lot. The other question is how are watercourse setbacks are protected in new developments. In new developments, we don't typically run into variances for aquatic setbacks. The reason for that is general policy that if it's a new development that it should be land area. You have a land area and you have attributes within that land area that need to be protected, so you work, if you will, within your paintable area in order to move through your development. Also, within the bylaw, it talks for residential properties, there's a clause in there about having minimum lot areas be exclusive of aquatic setback areas, which effectively does not allow, when we do new subdivisions, those lots are outside of that setback area, so they're protected by default. So if we do not create new lots that we run into, like we do the old lots that have conflict with the riparian protection. And what approvals does the city require to be working about watercourses? It depends on the scope of the project, but in and about watercourses, we definitely need what we call Section 11 notification or approval from the province under the Water Sustainability Act, and potentially approvals from Fisheries Oceans, depending on the scale of the development. This is a really quick flow chart of our development review process and the DPA. The key box I want to point out is this box here, which is once we get through to a development proposal, first questions we ask is, can the development permit area or the setback be avoided through reconfiguration, setback variances, etc., etc. And then if that cannot happen, that's when we go to the next step and ask for an environmental assessment or a rapid detailed report be completed to ensure that at a minimum it meets provincial standards. And this process would not only get past this point if we were probably looking at older lots that are being grandfathered into or are legally non-conforming. Quick note about development permit area 2 and environmentally intensive areas. As I mentioned before, there's several forms of environmentally intensive areas. Non-fish bearing watercourses and wetlands being one of them. Terrestrial herbaceous areas, older forests, and then looking at critical habitat or red and yellow list pieces of ore, those identified by coastal lake. The process within the environmental intensive area DPA is that development applications are received. We request an environmental assessment be completed by a qualified environmental professional, which is usually a registered professional biologist. The assessment is reviewed by staff, and the ESA protection is done through permit conditions. And those development permit conditions are usually out of the environmental assessment and through recommendations of the environmental professional. The other part of DPA 2 is the marine foreshore, which is 15 meters from the natural boundary of the ocean. And this area is kind of interesting because it also falls in line with sea level rise and how we're going to address that in the future. And that also gives us a bit of protection that way. DPA 1 and 2 review through Reimagine Nanaimo and the request from council. There are some potential changes we're looking at, one of which is looking at changing the no net loss to a net gain policy. So therefore we will be looking at net gains of form and function of riparian when looking at potential variances. Changing stronger wording or making stronger wording for priority in the guidelines, things like avoid, mitigate, and compensate for encroachments, and stronger wording would be identifying the priority that these words mean, and then the idea is that we would avoid first, mitigate second, and compensate third. We're updating our mapping. Potentially require qualified environmental professional monitoring, post-development inspections, as well as reporting. Improved planting and maintenance standards for riparian restoration, which we've already moved into those standards by including restoration planting densities as well as maintenance schedules through the municipal engineering standards and specifications. And that's pretty much it for me. I probably went through that fairly quickly, so if there's any questions out there, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the overview on that. And yeah, we'll take questions and then a bit of a discussion. I'm hoping that we can provide some feedback on possible updates, that some of which are suggested up here, so that December 1st, maybe something a bit more substantial can come back of direction that we're headed in, and have some further conversation to support the drafting of this new DPA. So, Don, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I can honestly say that these variances are the ones that cause me the most grief and loss of sleep of all the things that we have to decide on council. And I'm wondering, can we pass a bylaw that comes into effect, say, 4 years from now, that tightens down the ability to make a variance so much that the people won't try after that certain date? And I guess this is specifically to lots made prior to 1996, so that we don't have these variances coming forward And if we do, they're all going to come forward in the next 4 years, because the new bylaw that's going to come into effect would make it just about impossible to do, to get variances, or they'll be so expensive as some along those lines.
Through the chair, and Jeremy, please jump in here whenever. It's not a bad idea, and I understand that tightening this up is definitely a goal of all of ours, because I don't like seeing these variances being done either. However, that being said, one of the things that a lot of folks don't see is the number of people we turn away that have requested variances. And hopefully we're coming to the end of where we have any further vacant lots, single-family residential vacant lots that are grandfathered in, if you will. So we won't be running into as many of these in the future. That's the hope. But I don't discount the idea of tightening things up within 4 years. I would have to look at how legislative authority would allow us to do that. But it's definitely positive thought.
Thank you. Jerome? Oh, Jeremy?
Oh, sure, thanks. Thank you, Chair. Maybe I'll just respond to, and just to say that, you know, the developers, property owners always have the right to apply to vary bylaws. Bylaws are, by their nature, sort of blunt tools. They don't necessarily reflect, you know, the specific context sometimes of a property. We try to put, and we're required to put guidelines in place that guide folks into, you know, understanding what it is. If they're seeking a variance, what they're understanding what it is that you know, they need to put forward as a rationale. What, you know, in what case a variance might be considered as appropriate. Obviously, and you know, we've had conversations with council as well about the implications of sterilizing properties through potentially through bylaw, and the implications of that. There, you know, again, property owners do have the right to seek variances, and you know, we have an obligation to kind of consider them when they're appropriate. But you know, I'll just put that out there. There's definitely some, you know, some work to do in improving the guidelines that we have in place, the framework that we have in place. But I don't know if Kevin, I didn't catch if Kevin spoke to this, but we do follow and we participate in this information that's put together, which is called the Green Bylaw Toolkit, which kind of sets out the best practices standards as far as the local government should be implementing in the way of you know, different environmental protection measures, including riparian areas. As of the last round of update to the Green Bylaws Toolkit, 2016, we were the, I would say we're considered so the gold standard, leading in many areas of watercourse protection. So it's not that we don't have decent protections in place. We can definitely improve on those, and we're actually expecting, as a bit of context too, we're expecting in the next month or so, hopefully it feeds well into the policy discussion that we're having here and the decisions, our recommendations in December, but we're actually expecting an update to the Green Bylaws Toolkit. So hopefully we're going to be able to bring forward a package, a framework that we can consider in reflection to the best practice standards that are out there in the province right now. So I just wanted to throw that out for context. Thanks.
Thank you. Jerome?
Thanks. Just a couple of questions. I'm wondering how these riparian setbacks match or do not match with, say, other setbacks like slope stability requirements, setbacks from the edge of a cliff or whatever, which often can be overlapping environments. Right? Are these coherent together, or are there cases where one is more restrictive than the other? And then I guess my other question was, how does that apply, or how does that work with the RDN regulations? Because some of the watercourses cross right over the boundary, and at some point the rules change. So are these coherent across the two cities and IMO and RDN, or are they coherent across different sets of rules for different reasons?
Through the chair, with regards to what's out in the RDN, there are two separate sets of rules because the RDN has applied the riparian area assessment blanket methodology on how they're applying the riparian area protection regulation. So we've gone from the meet or exceed process. Right. They went to the blanket process where they have an RAA of 30 meters, and any development in that triggers the detailed assessment. With regards to slope stability, I won't say this is always the case, but when we're talking about water courses and slope stability, if we're into areas where we have slope stability issues, then generally our top of bank would be at the top of that slope. So there are some examples in Nanaimo where we have slope stability issues, and when we look at when we look at the watercourse protection, the top of bank is actually the top of the slope. So you get top of bank at the top of the slope plus your setback, which pushes you further away. That being said, watercourse and riparian protection and geotechnical issues, although being the same and working together, are different realities when it comes to legislation and professions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just wondering if there's any advantage of trying to get them to be, you know.
I think they are already together where they can be.
Yeah. Okay. That was more of a curiosity question.
Jeremy?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to add to that too. It's a good question about the geotechnical setbacks, and oftentimes the riparian setback will exceed, but it really depends on the geotechnical conditions. We have areas that, you know, they're mostly coastal, but that there are significant geotechnical issues with significant setbacks that are determined by, as Kevin mentioned, you know, appropriately qualified professional, and those take into effect the hazardous conditions there. So geotechnical hazardous conditions, and yeah, I think it's probably also worth mentioning as context that, you know, where other, and kind of feeding on what you said, where other bylaw requirements apply, for instance, you know, if there are other required setbacks, yard setbacks, we look to, it's one of the things that, you know, go through in the evaluation of potential application is there an opportunity to vary another setback other than the watercourse setback that would make more sense, would offer a higher level of protection to the watercourse. So that is one aspect of evaluation. I just thought I should highlight that for context as well.
Great. Thank you. Jerome, did you have something more? Your hand's still up there. Okay. Yeah, I've got a few questions and some comments. I think I initially brought this forward to be reviewed after the decision on the house on Cottle Creek. Just watching the implementation of it, I think that the law was created in 96, or after 96, after that first bylaw was put in place, and the conditions to create the lot were that it had, the footprint of the house had to be able to be created outside of the setback area, which it was determined that it could. And then, you know, with the changes, with the provincial updates and the further changes to our bylaw, when we implemented the DPA, the final outcome was a house that encroached further into that initial setback that was set for that that allowed for the creation of the lot in the first place. And seeing how that went down, basically my understanding of the process was that the lot was somewhat sterilized because of the 30-meter setback, so that triggered a DPA process. So then the proponent went out and got a qualified professional. That qualified professional went in and measured the SPIA, and the SPIA came back at being like a 7.5 meter setback from stream side, which I think is below the minimum, which is 10 meters. And so they came back and said, okay, 10 meters is the new setback. And then the proponent went out and did the design for their home, which went right up to that 10 meters, a large deck, maximized all possible space possible to put their house on it. And then staff and the QEP, everybody met up at the property, and there was, negotiation around wildlife fencing and restoration of the stream bank. But there was no ability to negotiate, additional room for qualities like, wildlife corridor, or just basic trying to increase the square footage of permeable surface of biologically active landscape, especially given it was on one of the three major streams. And so I submitted the sort of bit of an analysis on this, and I think the no net loss is an important thing to look at, how we can maybe change it to net gain. But I'm curious, I guess my first question is that, is there any way, it seems to me that whenever a DPA is triggered, it always goes to being the streamside protection setback, which basically only looks at fish habitat as becoming the minimum setback that determines where the development ends up going, and no other variables or no other values such as the streamside hydrology and the hydrology of the riparian area, and its values for hydrological cycles, or wildlife values, or even public access or public well-being values are able to be measured and used as a bit of a metric to allow staff to say, well, actually, no, even though the SPIA is this, because of all these other values we've measured, there's a methodology that says that we actually need to preserve X amount of space or push back a little bit on it to make sure that to try to get as much for the community as possible. And I'm curious, is there a way that we can put in those values or ways of measuring it that can give staff a little bit more to stand on, instead of just having to default to the SPIA?
I guess that's to me, through the chair. I think partially we already do that. I'm sure there are, if we wanted to put direct methodologies or technical bulletins within our DPAs to say, we need to consider all of these things. I mean, when we consider a development permit in these areas, you're absolutely correct. The first thing we have to do is make sure we meet the wrapper requirements, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we completely vary the bylaw every time down to 10 meters or whatever. There's a lot of times where we will only vary what's necessary in order to accomplish the development after we've discussed it and negotiated with the applicant to reduce the house footprint, change the layout, various different things to minimize the amount of encroachment into those setbacks. And we always intend to minimize the encroachment. But I'm sure we could do some research and find some mechanisms, or even ask for greater detailed assessments rather than just the riparian area protection regulation detailed assessment, because the detailed assessment is very methodical, if you will. You measure a number of things and assess a couple of things here, and then the math tells you what the setback is going to be. Where one of the problems with the riparian area protection regulation is that it takes away from professional opinion and professional knowledge to some extent when it comes to those other functions of riparian values. And that's part of the challenge that we have here, is how to balance that legislation and our legislation at the same time. And I can assure you we do try to minimize any variances we even ever look at.
I think that would be great if there was any methodologies that could be incorporated in, that could be done prior to the proponent going out and spending all the money on getting a design, because I imagine it's pretty awkward. Like, they spend the money on the QEP does the riparian area, the SPIA setback. Then based on that SPIA setback, the proponent goes out and pays all this money for these plans, and then they show up on site with these plans, and then staff walks around and looks at it and like, well, if we wanted to add in these other values in here, and then having to like push back on a design plan that they've already kind of thought through and invested in, it just sets up for more of a conflict situation, as opposed to going out first off and be like, actually, this is the area that we want to protect for these values. These are the methodologies that we use to set it up. Can you fit your house into this footprint here? As opposed to sort of like doing it the other way around. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the process that actually happens in the field, but that's kind of, from my experience at the place on Cottle Creek, that's kind of like was a sequence of events.
To the chair, yes, I would agree that was the basic sequence of events, but I think there was a lot more underlying internal discussion with the applicant around many of these issues that you brought forward. Just for an example of what you're talking about, when we do developments or large-scale developments in ESAs, steep slopes, those types of areas, we ask for what we call as a biophysical assessment or inventory of the land, and the intent of that is that it identifies the environmental attributes of the site, and then from there we apply protection to that. And what it does is it gives the landowner or developer the roadmap to say, here's the area that is protected, and here's the area that is developable, and here's where you can put your roads, and it takes into consideration not only the environmental attributes, but the geotechnical attributes and all the attributes of the site to try to create best protection for the environment stuff, but also allow for a monetarily or physically sustainable development in a lot of cases.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to say I appreciate the comments, and we can definitely look at, in the form of guidelines, which, we have to be, the idea is that they're worded to provide clarity on what information is required to support consideration of approval. They should be able to follow the guidelines and clearly understand, like you said, what information is required, what values are considered. The riparian area protection regulations definitely sets out some clarity around fish habitat or riparian area protection related to the provincial framework around fisheries values. and we can definitely look at, and as Kevin indicated, explore different options based on the of language that we might be able to consider in the guidelines based on the values you've identified. So appreciate that.
And just further on that, if there's no other comments from committee members, is I think like how a lot of members of the community see it is that there's like this setback, 30 meter or a 15 meter setback, and given that all the other lands, land is developed, that those are the minimums to have a healthy wildlife corridor, to save enough non-developed land to allow, proper water filtration and water balancing, to allow the opportunity maybe for people, the public, to access these stream corridors, and that any encroachment on that is now is going past that minimum, and that obviously there's all these areas of land that don't conform to those setbacks, but is our policy a way to set up that we're always pushing to only allow the minimum amount of development? Because and that's the way that they should be framed, so that in an area that is sterilized, instead of having all this other assessment needed and the cost of QEPs and that, to just have it that where variance is needed to avoid being sued for lot sterilization, to just work with the person to allow the minimum possible development on that site, and have I don't know if there's a lot of lots like this anymore, because for new development, I think our watercourse regulations are working great. It's in these cases where there's old development, either redevelopment or these lots that haven't been developed yet, that have been grandfathered in, where the problem is, and looking more at a home plate method that just says, if your lot's sterilized, this is the minimum amount that you're allowed to have a dwelling on it, and it's based, something that's livable, but not something with a 600 or 1,000, square foot deck, and to play it that way, and that would maximize our ability to protect as much land as possible that's already, very limited in scope. And I'm curious your thoughts on that home plate approach, as opposed to a much more convoluted process that we currently have now.
If I could, Chair, and maybe Kevin can jump in on some of the details, but yeah, that's definitely something we can look at a home plate piece to the guidelines potentially. That's done. That has been done in other areas. For instance, around agricultural land reserve and protection of agricultural land from the expansion of monster homes and that type of thing. It can be done in relation to watercourse protection. I don't know. I think as far as the science and the information behind what's appropriate, and Kevin can speak more to the guidelines that registered professional biologists follow, in addition to the riparian area protection regulations and the other information that we require of them to consider variances. I think that's I think they would have to provide that information, because if they were seeking a variance, because we've of the approach that we've chosen to implement the riparian area protection regulations. And it actually offers, our approach offers a very high level of protection, and as you flagged through new development, Chair, Ben, you've identified clearly, I think we're achieving really great results through newer subdivisions. There's many examples around the city that you've probably seen and we could point to, it is, these lots that have existed prior to the implementation of our strong protections around watercourse protection. And if you look at if you look at the regional district of Nanaimo as an example, they use a different methodology that basically it relies simply on the outcome of the SPIA, the outcome of the riparian area protection assessment by the qualified professional. So yeah, we do offer a higher level of protection. I think it would be, I don't think we can actually completely avoid, and I don't think it would be appropriate, just speaking bluntly, because again, bylaws are blunt tools. We have to consider the context. We have to provide reasonable opportunity and information, identify information required for people to seek variances, and as well, there's the provincial riparian area protection regulation overlay that we're implementing through the measures that we have in place. Maybe if Kevin wants to add to my understanding on that, as far as the requirements under the provincial riparian area protection regulations and the way we've chosen to implement it, I don't believe we can waive the requirement for that information. I think it's going to be part of what we'll have to consider if somebody's applying for variance.
Yeah, through the chair, I think as soon as we trigger a variance, we trigger the riparian area protection regulation process. One of the things I negated to say when I was talking about the differences between the wrapper and our bylaw is exactly what Jeremy just said, is that the riparian area protection regulation doesn't provide as much protection as our current bylaws do. And it's a very, in a way, non-biological way to establish protection on, as Councillor Rusbeck has identified, can be a very complex riparian ecosystem that has many functions. So I think it's all part of the parcel, but I would have to do some digging to find out, first of all, how do we amend? It would mean, and Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong with this, creating a home plate or footprint idea would mean changes of the zoning laws with regards to house sizes in specific zones or specific DPAs. And it would also mean coming up with a terms of reference for riparian assessment in these scenarios, for biological assessment in these scenarios. That looks specific at the form and function of the riparian that currently exists on that central lot, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Is your hand up there?
Yes, Sir Chair, just quickly to follow up to Kevin's comments, I don't think we wouldn't necessarily have to implement home plate within the zoning bylaw. That would be more complicated and challenging, as that's how we've chosen the bylaw setbacks, how we've chosen to implement the riparian area protection regulations and the requirements, the conditions that trigger an assessment under the riparian area protection regulations. That's the zoning bylaw setback. I think what we could do is speak to more clearly to the home plate idea in the guidelines, have some consideration around that in the way of, and I think what you're getting to is, if I understand correctly, is sort of make it clear sort of what's supportable, what rationale and sort of generally limitations and sort of values are up for consideration in requesting a variance. So I think we can probably look at ways that we can spell that out more clearly based on the feedback that has been provided tonight.
Okay, great. In terms of the feedback of looking at a potential home plate policy, and then, you know, looking at I don't know exactly how to describe them, the methodologies, or being able to evaluate, you know, other values of the riparian area, in making a determination of what is the appropriate minimum setback, or to determine what the appropriate development area is going to be. Is that something that we need a motion of recommendation to go do from this committee, or is that something that you're able to just go from the feedback and come back?
Yes, thank you. If it's okay if I go ahead with that, Chair. Yeah, we can just come back with the discussion that has been provided. It's some good clarity. We don't need a motion. We'll be, I think we anticipate bringing forward some options to the committee in December.
Okay. And then just with respect to looking at changes from no net loss change to net gain, you know, I think that I'd be very interested in seeing that. A question around the stronger wording around priority guidelines with words like avoid, mitigate, and compensate encroachment. I'm just curious to hear a bit more on that, and how that would allow, and especially if the guidelines do get put into the bylaws, how that would increase sort of the ability for staff to soundly provide, you know, sound rationale, and I guess proactively set the tone for what would be asked for from the developer, and setting clear boundaries and expectations.
Thank you, Chair. I'll let Kevin, he's jumping in, I'll let him speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, through the Chair, I guess with regards to the comment around the priority guidelines, we currently already work on the avoid, mitigate, and compensate approach, where our strongest push right off the start is to avoid encroachments into the setback areas. Stronger wording into the guidelines is that these words aren't really there right now, although we do it. I won't say by default, but we already currently do it internally, and when we work with the developers or landowners, those are the steps we have. And I think by putting it in the guidelines for it to be seen and having it defined in a manner gives it a little more teeth, that's the approach we're taking.
Excellent. I think that would be helpful, and again, like, you know, I think my frame is, you're quite right, we don't recognize the amount of work, you know, especially for larger subdivisions and development approvals that are new, that this stuff is really protecting riparian areas quite effectively. And I think my experience is seeing these rare cases of you know, lots that haven't been yet developed that are in, you know, sterilized areas and whatnot, and maybe that's more appropriate, like really you know, if that's an issue, and what scale of an issue that still is going to be. Not sure on that, but yeah, is there, just on the discussion, you know, anybody from the committee have any comments on this? We're getting close to wrapping up here. Okay, I've got one final question. Just in terms of required QEP monitoring, post-development inspection reporting, improved planting and maintenance standards for riparian restoration. I know a lot of times we've, you know, as part of our our past no net loss, there's been a requirement, you know, if there's going to be encroachment, we require for plantings to be done and restoration. Are these suggestions put in here the fact that, like, are we seeing that the follow through on our restoration efforts on private land may not be being implemented to the degree that we would hope.
To the chair, to a certain extent, my comment is that they have been improving dramatically over time. So the more recent ones are much better than the ones that were, say, 10 years ago. The idea about requiring qualified environmental official monitoring, post-development inspections, and reporting, etc., follows in line with the standards of practice that have been set out for the riparian area protection regulation. So we want to incorporate some of that stuff, which is already kind of mandated by the professionals, but a lot of the landowners and developers don't want to pay for, into our guidelines as well, which is a kind of a double, it's a double push to get it to happen, and to make sure that the first of all, the development was built as it was expected to build, that the mitigation and measures that were recommended by the qualified environmental official were actually completed. They followed the plans that were set in place for them, and then from there, was the planting done to standards, was the maintenance done so that the restoration has a chance to survive, and those types of things over time. I think if we were going to look at things like net gain, there are mechanisms out there where you can, there's what we call habitat balancing models, where you take, I'll just use a quick example, you lose 5 meters of a riparian, that's grass, and you replant 10 meters of form and functional riparian area, and you work that balance across to say, okay, well, we've improved, and the other part that comes into these models is also time. So, of course, that restored riparian, as time moves on, becomes more and more functional, because it gets larger and more mature. So, there's a bunch of variables that get taken into consideration when we talk about net gain. It's not just area to area anymore, so it's not like the net loss calculation.
Okay, great. I just realized we are over time here. Kevin, I really appreciate the presentation on this. I really like the suggestions for updating, so I hope that those are pursued, plus sort of the additional feedback that was given today. So thank you so much. And if there's no other questions from the committee, take a motion to adjourn. Oh, Dr. Bonner. Councillor Bonner.
Anyhow, Bonner, we have a couple of items that we have to pass regarding our date calendar, or is that other information?
Through the chair, that is just provided for information.
It's just provided for information, but good eye there, Don.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds good.
Motion to adjourn. Moved by Don, seconded by Jerome. All in favor? Adjourn.